Here's the tectorial membrane. It's attached to the base of the occiput and to the body of the axis. Continuing as the posterior longitudinal ligament, it's attached to the backs of the vertebral bodies all the way down the spine. Now we'll look at the ligaments which hold the odontoid process in place, making it the stable pivot round which rotation of the head occurs. We'll see the transverse ligament of the atlas, the cruciform ligament, which the transverse ligament is part of, and the alar ligaments. To see them, we'll go back to the previous rear view and remove the tectorial membrane. Directly beneath the tectorial membrane is this strong and important ligament, the transverse ligament of the atlas. The transverse ligament is attached on each side to these two tubercles on the atlas. The transverse ligament prevents the odontoid process from being displaced backwards. A slender ligament, the superior band, runs upward from the transverse ligament to the base of the occiput. Another one, the inferior band, runs downward to the body of the axis. These, along with the transverse ligament of the atlas, are referred to collectively as the cruciform ligament. We'll remove all of the cruciform ligament to see the odontoid process and the alar ligaments. Here's the odontoid process. Here are the massive alar ligaments. They pass from here on the odontoid process to here on the inside of the occipital condyles. The alar ligaments limit rotation of the head, especially in lateral flexion. Here's the side view again. Here's the tectorial membrane. Here in front of it is the divided transverse ligament of the atlas. It's quite an impressive structure. Lastly, we'll look at the ligaments that connect the vertebral arches. The arches of the regular cervical vertebrae are held together by strips of yellow fiber cartilage, known collectively as the ligamentum flavum. The arches of the axis and the atlas and the edges of the foramen magnum are held together by these loose and flexible sleeves of fibrous tissue, the atlanto-occipital and atlanto-axial ligaments. We've looked at a lot of anatomy already. Before we move on to look at the muscles, let's review what we've seen of the bones, joints and ligaments of this very fundamental part of the head and neck. Here's the occipital bone and the temporal bone. Here are the basal part and the squamous part of the occipital bone. The foramen magnum, the occipital condyles, the external occipital protuberance, the superior and inferior nuchal lines. On the temporal bone, here's the petrous part and the squamous part. Here are the mastoid process, the zygomatic arch, and the surface for the temporomandibular joint. Here's the external auditory meatus and the styloid process. The stylomastoid foramen, the carotid canal, the jugular foramen, and the hypoglossal canal. On a typical cervical vertebra, here's the body, the neural arch, the vertebral foramen, the spinous process, the transverse processes, the articular surfaces, and the articular pillar. On the atlas vertebra, here's the anterior arch, the posterior arch, and the lateral bodies. On the axis vertebra, here's the odontoid process. Here are the intervertebral joints and the intervertebral discs. Here are the atlanto-occipital and atlantoaxial joints. Here's the nuchal ligament, the anterior longitudinal ligament, the posterior longitudinal ligament, and the tectorial membrane. Here's the cruciform ligament, consisting of the transverse ligament of the atlas, the superior band, and the inferior band. And here are the two alar ligaments. Now we'll look at the principal muscles of the neck. We'll build up our picture from the inside to the outside. We'll start with 4 short muscles on the underside of the occiput, the 2 oblique muscles and the 2 rectus muscles. Collectively, these are called the suboccipital muscles. Here are the 2 rectus capitis muscles, minor and major. Rectus capitis minor goes from the middle of the posterior arch of the atlas to this area on the occiput. Rectus capitis major goes from the spinous process of the atlas to here on the occiput. Here are the 2 oblique or obliquus capitis muscles, the inferior and the much smaller superior. The inferior oblique goes from the spine of the axis vertebra to the transverse process of the atlas. The superior oblique goes from the transverse process of the atlas to here on the occiput. The action of the suboccipital muscles is to extend the head and to rotate it toward the same side. Next we'll go round to the front to see the longus muscles and the scalene muscles. Here are the longus muscles, longus cervicis here, merging with longus capitis higher up. Longus capitis arises from the base of the occiput and inserts on the transverse processes of C3, 4, and 5. Longus cervicis arises from the bodies of C1 to 4 and inserts on the bodies of the vertebrae from C5 all the way down to T4. Longus capitis and cervicis are weak flexors of the head and cervical spine. Next we'll add the 3 scalene muscles to the picture. The anterior scalene, middle scalene, and posterior scalene. They arise from the transverse processes of the lower 5 cervical vertebrae. The anterior scalene from the anterior tubercles, the middle and posterior scalene from the posterior tubercles. The anterior and middle scalene muscles insert on the first rib. The posterior scalene inserts on the first and second ribs. The scalene muscles are involved not in movements of the neck, but in elevating the upper ribs in deep inspiration. The scalene muscles have important relationships to the subclavian artery and the brachial plexus, shown in volume 1 of this atlas. Now we'll add the clavicles and the scapulae to the picture and go round to the back again to look at 3 large muscles that shape the back of the neck: semispinalis, splenius, and trapezius. We'll add semispinalis to the picture first. Here's semispinalis. It arises by many tendons of origin from the articular processes of C4 to C7 and from the transverse processes of T1 to T6. Semispinalis runs almost vertically to insert here on the occiput, just behind the 2 rectus muscles. The action of semispinalis is to extend the head. In addition, when we're upright or leaning forward, the tonic action of semispinalis prevents gravity from flexing the head. Next we'll add splenius to the picture. Here's splenius. It's a broad strap of muscle which arises from the spinous processes of T3 to C7 and from the lower half of the nuchal ligament. Splenius passes upward and laterally to insert in the lateral half of the superior nuchal line